Tonight, we're drifting back to the moments when fire from the earth dimmed the sun, chilled the seasons, and some scientists argue, nearly pushed humanity to the edge. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the day unwind from your shoulders. As we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Share your corner of the map in the comments. Now breathe easy and listen as ash, ocean, and time whisper the story of when volcanoes almost ended us and how people kept going. Night settles over a much older world, and the first cool breaths of a long winter drift like pale veils across grasslands and rainforest edges. Far to the west, a lake has not yet become a lake. It is a mountain with a hidden furnace, a deep-bellied thing that groans softly to itself, shaping pressure into prophecy. People move in small bands beneath wide skies. They know the constellations as if they were beadwork threaded through darkness. They carry fire in knotted bark and cradle it like a sleeping child. In the hush before dawn, a hunter tests a point with his thumb. A gatherer closes her hand around the safe weight of a river stone. Children learn the songs that keep wolves away and call each other home. The earth seems steady in their hands. Then the mountain opens, not with a single shout, but with layer after layer of sound. The cracking of buried ribs, the thunder of rock becoming ash, the sky taking a taste of the underworld and not letting it go. Light vanishes behind a rising roof of dust. Day wears a grey mask. The sun, so certain until now, begins to behave like a candle cupped in trembling fingers. Far beyond the rim, winds shoulder this veil and walk it across oceans. Snow drifts into seasons where none belongs. Rains move to new addresses. The edges of fields curl. Birds reroute their plans with restless wings. Somewhere, people stand in a clearing and listen for the old cues. The frog that should be a bell, the seed that should be a calendar, and the cues arrive late or not at all. But humans are listeners to more than one kind of music. They listen to water as it punches through reed beds, to the quiet mathematics of tracks on damp ground, to the soft logic of coastlines that promise food even when inland routes turn bitter. They read tide tables from the moon and taste the sea for clues. When the grasslands thin and the herds grow spare, they walk toward river mouths where fish sleep in cold pockets, where shellfish wait beneath sand like small sealed jars of strength. They learn that a shoreline can be a pantry, and a mangrove is a ladder into tomorrow. Nets are knotted from plant fibers and patience. Hooks are carved from bone with a care that borders on prayer. Fires are coaxed into staying overnight, into becoming part of the camp's memory. Someone blows gently on a bed of coals, and the breath becomes a bridge between days. The air does not warm the way it used to. Mist lingers as if unsure where to go. In the mornings, people pay attention to silence and what silence hides. They notice that the fruiting trees keep their promises less often, so they keep theirs more fiercely, sharing and swapping, guarding seeds, drying strips of meat when luck returns. The old roots between waterhole and cave are redrawn, thin lines tugged toward the coast or the sheltered valley, toward the place where rock spills into river and wind can be read from the bend of reed stalks. A grandmother shows a child how to find sweet water under sand with a digging stick. A father kneels to press a line of stones around a fire so that it will not wander in a restless breeze. A group decides, without speeches, to leave before the first frost that is not supposed to come. Stories become tools. Around embers, the color of pomegranate, people describe a time when the sky wore a heavy robe and animals changed their schedules. A clever child repeats the tale with new details, as if trying on a better coat against the cold. Someone adds a refrain. Do not sleep without tinder. Do not walk without a way to make sparks. Take the old fire and marry it to the new. Memory is braided with instruction until no one can tell where comfort ends and information begins. Even children carry tasks with the gravity of river stones. They gather resin that makes kindling brave. They learn that green wood argues and dry wood agrees, that a cooking pit dug in sand holds heat like a promise. Across mountains and islands, the ash settles into thin pages inside caves, into the quiet bottoms of lakes, into the lungs of seasons. People read it without letters. They read it by changing tempo. Where herds still pass, they trail them at a respectful distance, harvesting what movement leaves behind. Where the herds choose absence, hands turn to water, to birds' eggs, to the large, slow clams that live by the patience of tides. Spears are tipped with flakes that bite cleanly. Snares are set at the clever height for rabbit and not fox. When rain arrives sideways, shelters lean the other way. When wind teaches a new direction, doorway mouths are shifted, and sleep moves with them. There are arguments because survival has always made room for hard opinions. One path is shorter, another safer. One cove has better mussels, another has fewer crocodiles. But the bands remain bands. They understand that a small group is a fire that can go out if not fed. So they trade names, tools, and spouses along the coast like beads along a cord, keeping the cord unbroken. They recognize faces from last season who now carry different children. They swap news of a headland where the sea's breath tastes sharper, and a lagoon where the fish are silver coins flipping just beneath the surface. When the wind carves a dune into a new shape, a scout marks it in memory, and the map of the mind updates itself without ceremony. Nights grow long, but not empty. Under the grey dim stars, nappers shape glassy stone with a rhythm that slows the heart into steadiness. Singers lengthen the notes so they last until warmth returns to fingers. A child learns to strike pyrite against flint until surprise becomes technique, and technique becomes confidence. The camp eats, then listens for predators with the kind of attention that turns nerves into instruments. Somewhere, a mother tells a child that smoke is a rope the camp throws up to the sky, so the sky will remember where they are. The child watches the rope drift and hold, drift and hold. Time passes not in calendars, but in skills accumulated. People test roots with their tongues and learn which need boiling twice. They discover that a skin of ash on a cooking stone makes it less likely to crack when river water hisses on it. They figure out that a shallow trench around a shelter door persuades rain to take another path. Someone notices that fish travel in from the deep when the moon has a certain thinness, and a calendar is planted in a mind. Someone else recognizes that birds fuss in a particular way before a storm moves in from the open sea, so snares are checked early and fires are fed while tinder is still generous. Step by step, small certainties accumulate until they are a raft. And still, the cold insists. It suggests new routes for migration and new lengths for hunger. Smoke columns from distant camps look like thinking made visible. Now and then, there is a warm day that pretends to be a kindness, and people spend it like a coin, mending nets, walking farther, teaching slower so the knowledge sticks. When earthquakes purl underfoot, they listen to their ancestors' instruction to keep baskets ready and bundles light. When ash falls again, there is already a woven cover for the water jars. When a stray ember flies, there is a foot ready to press it home. The world does not end. It narrows, then it opens a hand's width, then it narrows again. People keep their own kind of weather inside the circle of the fire. They arrange stones to remember places. They arrange words to remember choices. They leave marks in caves that say, "We were here, and we understood what we had to." They leave shell middens that say, "We learned to read tides, and we learned quickly." They leave children who can pull a spark from dull-looking rocks and make a meal from a coastline that seemed, at first, like only wind and salt. The sky stays pale for longer than anyone wanted, yet in the pale there is enough to go on, enough to plan the next morning, enough to carry a small, stubborn summer in the breast pocket of the night. Morning light drifts across the Aegean like silk pulled through water, touching whitewashed walls, clay jars stacked like patient moons, and narrow streets scented with wine and crushed time. On the island that will someday be called Santorini, people wake to a calendar written in sailcloth and shoreline. Rooms are painted with lilies and dolphins that leap in a forever sea, plaster made bright with the careful breath of artisans who know how to turn stone dust into stories. Potters lean into a wheel's steady hum. Weavers count threads by fingertip. In courtyards, jars hold grain and olive oil, the slowed-down sunlight of other seasons. A child sits cross-legged near a doorway and learns the names of winds from an aunt who has sailed enough to trust the horizon. Traders in low, swift ships carry saffron, copper, and the remembered flavors of distant coves. The island is a hinge, turning between Crete and the Cyclades, between the mouth of the Nile and harbors where figs hang sweet over the water. The volcano in the island's heart is a high, quiet neighbor, greened with vineyards and goat paths. A mountain that smells of soil after rain. The first sign is small enough to fold into a shrug. A tremor threads cups on a table and leaves the finest rim line of wine moving as if thinking. Doors creak in a way that makes people look up at once, then share the same brief smile that says, "It was nothing this time." Fishers tell each other that the sea felt different under the keel at dawn, heavier somehow, as if listening back. Dogs avoid certain alleys. Somewhere, a merchant points to a hairline crack in a storeroom wall and says it was there last season too, and they both nod, even if they are not certain. Days pass in their usual shape. Nets are mended, amphorae are sealed, letters are traced into wet clay with a stylus and set in the sun to remember promises. But the island clears its throat again, and this time the sound stays in the chest. Ash arrives before fire, the way whisper arrives before speech. A scatter of pale dust drifts from an untroubled sky, too fine to be sand, too soft to be anything but new. People touch it, roll it between finger and thumb, and find it chalk cool. Not a thing from their fields. Birds shift nests to ledges sheltered from the open. Cisterns are covered with lids that fit like thinking caps. A few families carry their household gods to another room and give them fresh bread, not because they have become frightened, but because caution is a kind of hospitality. The sea sighs against the harbor walls, as if content to keep listening. When the mountain speaks, it does not begin with rage. It begins with a column of dark punctuation drawn into the sky, a pillar too straight to be a cloud, climbing until it finds the place where wind will take it by the hand. Then comes pumice, the light stone that floats, sifting down like a cruel inversion of snow, filling gutters and stacking in drifts against doorways. Sails whiten under it and then bow. The harbor changes its texture. Water wears a skin of pebbled lightness that grinds gently against hulls, and the oarsman's rhythm becomes oddly muffled. Somewhere, a man in a warehouse runs his thumb along a jar lip and tastes grit where there should be dust. The island air smells of wet clay baked too quickly, of salt snagged in smoke, of a new mineral language no one quite speaks. Ships hurry out not to fish, but to witness. They return to the lee of the island with eyes watering and speech shortened to essential nouns. Column, ash, lightning. Yes, lightning, because the sky's new tower invents its own weather. Veins of light that flicker within the plume, as if the mountain were thinking in flashes. Day tightens to a dimness that is not night. Lamps are lit to see the loom. People tie cloths around their mouths, learn to blink slowly, and share water before they drink it so others can wash grit from their lashes. Roofs are swept, then swept again, each swish quiet in the way of work that refuses panic. Then the mountain refuses delicacy. It pulls the ground into itself and drops it, and the island's center becomes a mouth. Air turns to sound. Stone turns to air. A wall of cloud moves like a living cliff across the water, and where it goes, the sea lifts and runs, not with the polite pulse of a tide, but with the long stride of something that has decided to ignore the usual rules. A wave enters the harbors of nearby islands and writes a rough new shoreline in a single paragraph. On Crete's northern coast, people in bright courtyards look up from accounting tablets as cisterns slosh, as jars ring subtly against each other, as the long shadows of columns take a new angle before noon. Boats torn from their moorings reappear strangely far inland, set down in orchards as if delivered by a forgetful giant. Fish glint on streets that were never meant to be wet. The warehouses where jars were lined like soldiers are now unbuttoned, and goods spill like a hurried decision. But on Thera itself, life narrows to ash and breath. The people of the town walk in careful lines, carrying what they can lift. Bronze tools wrapped in cloth, a jar of grain, a token of home. Doors are latched with a precision that feels like respect. Frescoes wink from the dim behind them. Blue monkeys, saffron gatherers, ships with painted prows. Images whose colors are still damp in the mind and now must be trusted to memory. The streets fill with a soft, steady scuff of sandals. Elders are guided by the elbow. Children count steps aloud, making a game of accuracy so that fear has to wait its turn. Outside the town, terraces give way to scrub, and the path rises toward a ridge where wind is a little cleaner. Looking back, They see the plume tower throwing its own shadow across the water like a sundial with no hour marks. In other ports, captains lean over charts that are less maps than conversations with the past. Trade routes braid Crete, Rhodes, Cyprus, and the Nile Delta. Each bead on that cord depends on the others not breaking. Now ash drifts like a slow curtain across the straits, and choices thicken. Some ships tack south, following the rumor of clearer air toward the Levant. Others hug the Dodecanese, stopping in coves where a spring hides under tamarisk, exchanging word-for-word reports that take the shape of weather. How many finger-widths of ash on the deck by sunset? How far the smell carries, whether the moon rose smudged or sharp. In palaces, where floors are polished enough to hold a second world upside down, administrators mark shipments delayed and prices edged upward. Copper becomes dearer than last month. Timber is valued like a patient. A tablet receives a neat mark that means the fleet is late, and a little later, another mark that means the fleet is later still. The sea keeps a pulse beneath the chaos. Even when pumice rafts drift like migrating islands, even when the sun chooses amber instead of gold for a week at a time, shoals still shelter fish. Eddies still hold their tiny feasts, and pilots who trust the knuckles of the land, those low profiles and familiar wakes, can find the quiet lanes between trouble. Net weights knock softly together on deck. A helmsman keeps a finger on the line that leads to the sail as if it were a lifeline, which today it is. In the dim, stars feel closer when they appear, and sailors speak to them by name, because names are steadiness. Back on the island, ash makes the simple things complicated. Cooking becomes engineering. Fire pits are deepened to keep sparks from climbing into the restless air. Bread is flattened thinner and baked faster. Food turned into speed so the fuel can be saved. Water jars wear lids tied down with twined reed. Hair is braided tight to make washing easier. People get good at small efficiencies, at stacking tasks so that no movement is wasted, bringing a handful of pebbles for the hearth while going to the latrine, checking the goat's tether every time someone returns from the spring, searching for a good place to sleep while the light still holds. A woman who knows dyes teaches another how to make a decent brown from a poor mix of ash and crushed bark. Clothes take the color of patience. A man who knows wood shows a boy how to listen for the tone inside a plank that says it is sound, not swollen, and that it will bear weight even after grit has scoured its face. Stories travel faster than ships. In Crete's halls, people describe the island in the north that lost its center and made a circle of itself. They tell of a city painted with dolphins that now listens under pumice. of courtyards that will be soft to the touch of future hands because ash kept them wrapped in a cool sleep. In small villages inland, shepherds hear from their trading cousins that the sea had the nerve to walk through the streets, and they answer with accounts of sheep starting at no sound and ewes keeping the lambs close, as if the sky had grown teeth. In markets where copper's shine attracts the eye, a woman selling saffron hears that the fields that once gleamed yellow now labor under grey, and she measures out her strands more carefully, makes a smaller cone in the palm of a buyer, and bows her head in apology that is also accounting. And yet life looks for its folded places. Ash makes good mortar when mixed and packed. Someone realizes this, and their walls stay truer against the wind. Fields spared the heaviest fall drink, strange minerals from the next rain, and grow in unexpected vigor. 2 seasons hence, a farmer who did not leave stays to see, and his neighbors who return later learn to ask his advice without pride. The wide world takes note in its own quiet tally. Rings in the old trees tighten. Mud on lake bottoms saves a thin grey bookmark between chapters of leaf and pollen. Ice whispers the news in bubbles caught like tiny bells. People do not hear those records, but they feel their bodies answer to thinner light and a slightly altered rhythm of storms, and they change their planting days accordingly without needing to call it science. In harbour towns that face north, messengers bearing the practical alphabet of goods bring new letters. What if the ship timbers come from a farther forest? Now, what if the copper must be escorted by more guards because one route no longer feels safe? What if the workshops begin saving shapes instead of just materials, molds and patterns carefully wrapped, so that if a kiln cracks, a future kiln can remember the vessels it must make? Even in the palaces, the courtyards fill at dusk with people who are not courtiers. Fishers invited to speak briefly about what water taught them today. Captains asked to lay a finger on the map and linger on a cove that might serve as a temporary harbour for a friend. Knowledge is invited to sit, and it sits, and it finds a cushion, and it is not quickly asked to leave. The volcano breathes in cycles that are large beside a human chest. It sends out ash, then quiets, then a tremor runs like a thread through spoons again, then quiets. The island becomes a lesson in listening. A woman baking learns to read not only the color of the loaf's skit but the feel of the air, and if the air is heavy, she places the bread closer to the coals because heat will draw more slowly. A boy tasked with fetching water from a spring pays attention to the taste and brings back word that the mineral edge has sharpened today, and someone considers whether to use that water for dye instead of soup. A mason diversifies, He repairs walls in the morning and teaches children to cut stone in the afternoon, because hands that can shape a block can also repair a hearth. And a hearth is a promise in uncertain light. A ship departs with a cargo smaller than before, but better wrapped, the way ideas are preserved when paper is rare. And the sea, the old translator, keeps speaking in two languages at once, risks and roots, danger and direction, warning and welcome. Oars rise and fall like steady breath. Nets travel out and return with silver arguments. In their mesh, ash makes sunsets that people stand and watch without telling themselves why. Gold giving way to copper, to a lingering violet that seems to hang from some invisible lintel. In that slow fade, conversations about where to go next take on the tone of weather reports rather than prophecy. The islanders practice leaving without panic, arriving without ceremony, and standing still without forgetting to look up. They keep a small bag packed with the things that turn shelter into home: flint, cord, a cup with a decent handle, a little packet of spice, and they keep it near the door, not as surrender, but as readiness. Somewhere, a child traces the line of a ship on a wall with a fingertip, learning the curve, making in their mind a vessel strong enough to carry a family across a sea that has learned new moods and still invites a careful passage. Even before the ship's bells marked the hour, mornings in 1816 woke as if they had turned their faces to the wall. The light was there, but it arrived thinned and bruised, as though it had come a long way. Carrying news it didn't want to say aloud. The year wore two coats at once, a calendar that insisted on spring and summer, and a weather that preferred November. Pilgrims of fog crossed fields that should have glowed green. Puddles stiffened at dawn in months when children expected to skip stones. Windows breathed on the inside. In kitchens, where bread usually rose like good conversation, dough sulked and needed coaxing and extra time, as if it too missed the true sun. Far away, a mountain had emptied part of itself into the sky, and the sky had decided to remember. Across the Indonesian archipelago, traders who were good at noticing small differences had noticed a big one. First, a glare on the horizon that was not sunrise, the sound of thunder with no storm, a dust that did not taste like any road. Ash had climbed into heights that keep secrets, found the cold lanes of the upper air, and set out to circle the globe. Weeks later, in places that could not even name the island, sunsets began to wear embroidery, threads of copper and peach, lingering purples that outstayed their welcome. Painters loved it and kept their distance. Children pointed, farmers watched and kept silent a little too long, then walked their fields with a hand outstretched to feel the temperature of leaves, the way a cook feels the readiness of a loaf's crust. A Vermont morning in June cooled a pitcher so quickly that the rim filmed over while it stood on a table by an open door. Frost sketched feathers across young corn. The day that promised planting asked for a fire instead, and someone fed it with staves saved for coopering because warmth trumps plans. At noon, the smoke climbed straight up into a windless sky the color of dull pewter, then spread like a thought that prefers not to choose a direction. By evening, neighbors compared notes and found that their gardens had taken the same pale, bitten look, like fields recovering from a long illness. They added a few potatoes to the pot and told themselves tomorrow would be different. But they also set aside a heavier shawl near the door. In Bavaria and Switzerland, rain behaved like a scholar who is convinced he has more to say. It interrupted, it footnoted, it took up time that belonged to the sun. Lakes wore new moods. In a villa on a hill above Genevan water, friends who had come for bright strolls along clear mornings found themselves turning lamps up at noon, trading walks for the warmth of a hearth, reading aloud until voices were soft with the hour. They told each other ghost stories because outside, the world had chosen a palette of haunted colors, the sick gold of filtered dusk, the blue that comes when clouds lose interest in distance. Lightning inked quick opinions behind mountains. Inside, paper gathered sentences like kindling, and a storm-worried summer put its breath into the lungs of tales where life stutters and returns changed. Town markets learned new arithmetic. Oats that last year bought a handful of needles now bought only a few pins. Rye had the sullen look of a plant that doesn't trust the day it was given. Barley turned the kind of brown that sighs. In some places, bakers altered their recipes with chicory, with mashed roots, with anything that would hold together under heat and give the mouth an honest task. In others, they propped their doors open longer and cut thinner slices in the spirit of getting through. Horses chewed quietly and then less quietly when feed was short, and wheelwrights discovered that a cart runs differently when the animal in front of it is hungry. In the gap, human legs reconsidered the kindness of wheels that don't need hay, and an idea for a running machine took thin shape. A frame sketched in the mind like a promise of balance. Letters crossed oceans more slowly than clouds, but they carried weather like a scent pressed into paper. A merchant in Liverpool wrote to a cousin in Boston that ships arrived grey, as if they had sailed through dusk all day long. A farmer on the St. Lawrence told a brother in the Tyrol that birds had flown south and then come back, confused, then flown south again, as if the compass itself had developed a stutter. In the Yangtze lowlands, Anzi Judizelons, Spring rice blinked at cold that did not belong to it, and in the highlands people watched their breath as if they had become their own small chimneys. Monsoons thought about it, and sometimes changed their minds. Coats stayed out of storage. Wool learned to be patient with skin when skin wanted linen. Even in places spared the worst, conversation adopted a careful verb tense. When warmth returns, when the good summer shows up, when this lightness in the pantry passes. Yet everywhere people argued gently with the season by doing. They replanted where they could, with quicker, braver seed. They found spots on slopes where sunlight collected like loose coin and moved beans there. They made soup that included the word again, because making it again means there was something to make it with. Fishing villages weighed the arguments of the water and decided early mornings were still generous, even when the noons were not. Nets came home with the silver proofs. In orchards, someone noticed that a tree on the south side of a wall kept its dignity better than the one standing alone, and walls began to matter not just for boundaries, but for warmth. A simple decision, move the beehives closer to stone, sounded like a small thing, and turned out to be a good one. Artists practiced listening with their eyes. Skies stretched longer at evening with layered veils of color no one had exactly seen before, and those who kept brushes clean could not help but try to pin the fleeting shades. A wash of strange rose became a habit of certain canvases. The world's changed light left fingerprints in galleries that would hang for generations and be admired by people who never knew the cold could talk to paint. At the same time, pastors shifted the tone of their sermons. The weather had made everyone practical, and practical is a cousin of merciful. They spoke less of punishment and more of bread, less of wrath and more of making sure the old woman at the end of the lane had wood enough when a surprise frost tapped the window. Bells rang longer. Collections were counted twice. The road westward in North America felt busier beneath its thin skin of dust. Families bundled children and kettles and the strongest of their furniture and walked toward rumors of better soil. Behind them, sledges scraped paths where wagon wheels would have been the plan, and someone said out loud that a place where the wind is straighter might also be a place where the weather knows what it's doing. In towns along the way, blacksmiths hammered their hours into useful shapes and added one silent nail to the coffers of families who couldn't pay. Militia storehouses quietly lost a little flour and gained, by a miracle of accounting, a few satisfied infants. On the edges of fields, scarecrows picked up second coats and began to look like careful ancestors. In India, the pages of the season's book fluttered out of order. Rains that should have arrived with a confident knock stood outside and considered, then tried the handle weakly, then left footprints that evaporated into air that forgot to be wet. Boats worked sandbars that had no business being there, and bargemen learned new paths by watching how the river spoke around their poles. When the dry edge extended its opinion too far, granaries practiced being generous. In the delta, a familiar fever decided it had been ignored long enough and cleared its throat. Healers boiled herbs and listened to pulses, and in their listening, the calendar of a new, long struggle began to assemble itself. Without announcement, people carried water more carefully, and in courtyards, women counted children more often than the habit of counting children usually asks for. Back in Europe, a housewife who had learned how to coax yeast through stubborn dough became the kind of person other women visited with questions. What do you do when the oven refuses its old language? When the smoke clings? When the chickens stay quiet longer? She spread advice like butter and made it stretch. A miller turned his wheels slower to keep from cracking grain that had learned to be hard in the wrong way, and his patience tasted like edible flour. A cooper shifted the angle of his staves to compensate for wood that swelled in damp summers that weren't supposed to be damp. In the next village over, a teacher put arithmetic to work on seed corn, drawing figures so the children could see how to save a future loaf from being an impulsive breakfast. Learning took the shape of storing. Ships that had learned the rhythm of trade altered their steps. Captains chose routes written by wind they trusted over speed, promised by wind they did not. In journals, hands careful with ink described skies crossed by pale veils and mornings that began inside a grey bell. The neat letters looked like a kind of weather themselves. Barometers set their needles like stubborn chins and watched the room. Mariners calculated how much light was left, not by the sun's height, but by the feel of metal under their palms, warm enough to suggest grace, cool enough to counsel prudence. The decks smelled of salt and rope, and the dust of distant explosions smoothed by time into something that could pass, at least for a while, as part of the ordinary load of the air. And still, daily life threaded itself through the altered year with the quiet confidence of habit. Someone spun flax, someone tuned a fiddle, someone swapped a good story for a small favor. In a London alley, a costermonger learned to read faces for who needed credit before they knew to ask. In a Silesian village, a grandmother decided that soup wants dill, even in a cold July, and grew a pot of it on a windowsill that found the day's thin beam. In New England, a boy practiced balancing on a wooden frame with wheels because balance seemed, just then, like the most reasonable prayer. In Java, men rebuilt ladders because ash had worn old ones smooth, and the new ones needed steps with more patience. In the Low Countries, Peat cutters graded their harvest from burns even in damp to keep for better times, and the piles looked like paragraphs. The world did not stop for the cold and the colored skies. It learned to move differently, to keep its weight low and its hands full of small tools. Evenings softened for a moment after chores, as they do in any year, and neighbors leaned on fences to compare the day's tricks. A woman in the Tyrol mentioned that beet leaves, if chopped fine and cooked long, make a stew that tastes almost pleased with itself. A fisherman on the Firth of Forth showed a friend how to tie a knot that holds when fingers are numb. A shepherd in the Auvergne found a south-facing hollow that offered his flock a quiet pocket of air a few degrees kinder than the hill crest, and taught his son to look for that kind of tenderness in the land. In a parlour thick with lamplight, a story crossed the room and settled in a young mind like a seed in warm loam, taking root because outside the wind had opinions and inside the words were steady, and somewhere far overhead the ash kept its cool path while people measured their days by bread and weather and the promising sound of a door opening to someone carrying a little more than they needed that night. Dawn comes to the Sunda Strait as a gentle rehearsal, fishermen easing boats off sand with shoulder and laugh, palm leaves combing the first breeze, the lighthouse on the rocky point still keeping its pale eye open a little longer than necessary. Between Java and Sumatra, the sea flexes in long, comfortable breaths. In villages built of woven mat walls and painted shutters, kettles begin their soft conversation. Traders look at the curve of wind in the fronds and count how many knots they can risk before noon. The volcanoes on the horizon are regular as relatives. Anak's elders not yet born, Rakatar and its kin rising like anchored clouds, and they wear the season's green without comment. Even in Batavia's offices, where ledgers weigh as much as anchors, clerks mop the night's humidity from their brows and smile at the island's dependable heat. Somewhere out past the reefs, a schooner feels the low swell and nods as if agreeing with a point just made by the water. The wires are awake early too. They hum along the coast, across town squares shaded by tamarinds, over rivers that braid themselves into deltas, and into the brick rooms where the operator's fingers do their brisk ballet. A message from Singapore taps its way to Batavia, and then to Buitenzorg, and then to coastal stations whose names are a string of beads on a cord laid along the shore. The sound is not quite music, not quite hailstorm, but it has the same promise of connection, dots and dashes lining up into grain prices, a ship's expected hour, a governor's request for more paper. Even far inland, where the forest rings like a bell when cicadas all choose the same note, the glass knob at the top of a pole flashes briefly with the first confidence of sunlight, and a boy looks up and imagines language traveling the way fish do, invisible but certain. The earth has been murmuring for weeks. Small tremors slosh water in cups and flirt with the edges of plates. In the lighthouse, the keeper tightens screws not because they have loosened, but because habit is a kind of spell against surprise. On a Sunday afternoon, Ash powders a laundry line not long after the shirts have gone up, and someone laughs at the indecency of the timing. In the Strait, sailors taste the air the way bakers taste batter, searching for that extra pinch of something. Sulfur, yes, but also a metallic hint, like a coin kept too long in a damp pocket. The crickets continue with their business. Goats argue politely in the yard. A telegram arrives from a station farther down the coast, remarking on a cloud with no sensible origin, and the operator on this end sends back a tidy acknowledgement, because tidy acknowledgements are the grease that keeps a network from squeaking. Then the mountain stops making small choices. The sound that follows has distance and closeness tangled together. It belongs both to the next island and to the inside of your chest. Windows learn a new language in a single sentence. A flex, a rattle, a bright brittle crack, and doors unlatch themselves without asking permission. In the lighthouse, the wick jumps, breathes too fast, then steadies under a hand that has steadying for a profession. In Batavia, ceiling fans sway like lazy metronomes, while in the street outside the fans building, the horses set their hooves wider and look at each other as if to compare notes. On ships in the Strait, sailors see the plume before they finish. Hearing the first paragraph, it rises like ink poured into water, columnar at the base, and then blooming into itself. The kind of height that makes a person want to take off their hat. Ash does what Ash has always done. It practices being everything at once. Snow that warms your hands, dust that weighs nothing, and also everything. Flour that ruins bread. It drifts sideways under eaves, lines the folds of a sarong like chalk, softens footsteps along garden paths, until the sound of walking becomes the sound of careful brushing. It finds the telegraph wires and makes them hum lower, a change of vowel in a word that used to be easy to pronounce. On deck, a man wipes a compass with the gentleness reserved for the instruments that confess their secrets slowly. On shore, women pull water jars closer to the door and hang cloth across the opening with the efficiency of the often sensible. And then the wave. It arrives at first like an argument the sea is having with itself, and then like a decision, shouldering past the points and into inlets not built for it, writing new lines across the sandbars and bending the geometry of harbors the way a strong hand bends a reed. A boat tied neatly to a post finds itself setting its own agenda 30 heartbeats later, both too heavy and too light to be the boat it was a minute ago. Men shout names, not orders. The telegraph stations closer to the shore match the tension of wire to the tension behind the eyes of the operators, and a few messages go out half-syllabled because the hand knows how to send faster than the room knows how to stay still. Inland, the wave becomes rumor before it becomes fact, and rumor chooses speed over shape. What travels faster than water is news. Is it still news if it travels faster than the event itself? The wires perform their remembered trick. A sentence born in a hot room with ash in its teeth taps its way through relay after relay and stands in a cool London morning, reading itself aloud to coffee cups and editors who did not plan to assign a headline to a place they've never loved enough to pronounce correctly. Submarine explosion, one story says, and another says volcanic disturbance, and somewhere a typesetter adds extraordinary barometric oscillations with a flourish, because extraordinary is a satisfying word to set. In between the wires and the ocean, barometers everywhere become poets, their needles tracing couplets of pressure that circle the globe and return, like a friend knocking again at the same door a few hours later to say, "I forgot one more thing." Telegraph operators begin to collect the unusual, times with circles around them, a scribble to mark the gust that smelled like a coal cellar, a note about how the birds did not know what to do with their wings for several minutes, and then decided in favor of altitude. In Batavia, the office fills with the same dusty light the streets were wearing, and messages arrive from Anja, Merak, Telok Betong, each with handwriting sneaking into the margins of the telegram, each with a word or two that would be considered poetry if they didn't also sound like inventory. Booming, darkness, stones. The operators swap brief nods that contain both compassion and the arithmetic of roots, and the identify and forward rhythm goes on. A map pinned to the wall gathers a small constellation of pins that suddenly seem to have a private conversation. Far away, in cities where summer smoke rises from factory stacks in familiar commas, the sky begins its own commentary. Sunsets wear a ring. Bishops would recognize it, a pale halo that sits patiently around the sun, like a thought that refuses to stop. Artists step outside and try to hold a palette up against this new grammar. They will later agree, quietly in salons and more loudly in pubs, that techniques suited to one kind of light do not always flatter another. People throw longer shadows than they used to. At midday, eyes squint as if there were a layer of gauze between them and the world. And in churches, a few heads tilt toward stained glass, not because the sermon needs help, but because color suddenly feels like an honest currency. In Iceland, a shepherd notices his sheep have become silhouettes at strange hours and learns to adjust the path home. In New York, a newsboy spills extras across a curb and watches the sky instead of the sidewalk. At sea, the air grows thick enough to be a substance, and ships write their names in it with their masts. Pumice collects against hulls and rubs the paint off like a persistent aunt. The helmsman steers by sound and the patient intelligence of wake, trusting the feel of pressure on the rudder as if it were a pulse. When the wave's ghost arrives long after the noise, the pressure wave's quiet slap felt by instruments from Zanzibar to Zanzibar's opposite. Captains compare barograph sheets like doctors consulting each other in a hallway. The pens have climbed and dropped and climbed again, as if the earth had coughed in stages. In cabin light that pretends it is enough, a master writes the date and hour and, because he cannot not, adds a line about the sky's color that would have gotten him teased in other years. The wires bind surprise to curiosity. In London, Paris, Batavia, Calcutta, Adelaide, papers call for reports, and reports arrive. Pressure traces, ash samples in folded paper, accounts of a lighthouse lamp going dim at noon. The neatness of the packets is a kind of defiance. On one table, a clerk whose job is usually soothing the movement of numbers into columns draws a circle instead. The world with pins where the wave was felt, lines showing its mawkish lapse around the globe. In another room, a postal sack comes in heavier than usual, and the man who lifts it recognizes the weight of collective attention. The society men assemble and clear their throats and pass around observations with the quiet solemnity of a harvest blessing. Somewhere in that cheerful bureaucracy, a new habit begins, the habit of letting instruments do some of the talking. In villages on both coasts of the strait, the days learn new chores. Ash collects even when no one is watching, and so watching becomes a chore too. Roofs are swept not just for tidiness, but for survival. The gathering kept light, so the woven walls don't give in to their own softened weight. Wells wear lids like hats. Children learn the game of who can tie a cloth over nose and mouth faster, and adults pretend not to notice they are practicing a skill that was not necessary last month. Oars are checked twice for hairline cracks. Nets are mended tight because fish are food, and food is a conversation that should not end abruptly. By evening, coughs are counted and old folks moved closer to doors where the air is at least honest, if not friendly. Lamps burn earlier, and their yellow becomes its own kind of weather. The telegraph is a character in this story, the way the monsoon is a character. Sometimes generous, sometimes late, always changing the conversation. A single operator in a wooden room with his sleeves rolled back and his hair carrying a day's worth of ash, can make a rumor into a fact by sending it, or a panic into calm by asking, in measured taps, for confirmation. Reports of vanished capes and quieted villages travel centimeters under fingertips and kilometers under wire. Responses travel back. In those narrow exchanges, the world shrinks and holds more at once. Sympathy that has to be brief because the line is busy. Precision learned from the way a coil behaves when the room grows hot. The sudden democracy of information when a fisherman's observation sits in the same ledger as a governor's complaint about schedules. Outside that network, the sky keeps working with its new toolset. Morning light is yoke-thin. Afternoons carry a metallic rasp that tastes like a coin on the tongue. Evenings burn their long copper wick, far past the hour when families used to go indoors. In Java, women lay dyed cloth in this altered sun to see how it behaves, and it behaves strangely, and they note the shifts with an expertise that no academy would think to ask for. In Sumatra, a man who collects birds notices that their songs are shorter, as if breath has become more expensive, and he changes his traps because to ignore the detail would be impolite. In the Straits settlements, a teacher brings his class outside with slates and tells them to draw what the sky says today, and the children draw rings and ladders of light, and a few add a ship because ships belong to any honest picture here. Ships keep coming and going because trade is a practice as stubborn as tide. When captains step ashore in Surabaya and Penang and Batavia, they tell the same stories in different accents. A dawn that arrived with the color of bruised plums, a noon that went dim as if remembering something sad, a sunset that startled even men too old to be startled by sunsets, and the strange low thunder that made the teacup rings sing for a moment. In exchange, they learn where ash lies, thick on the water, like an idea not yet argued into shape, and where a clear lane has opened by the grace of a current that insists on being itself. They put those lanes on the map with a pencil, measure them with time, and carry them to the next man who asks a sensible question. And while officials gather reports and charts put on their spectacles, and the world stations trace the passage of a wave they cannot see but can count, household time keeps its original beat. Rice is washed until the water runs clear, then set in a pot whose lid has been taught to fit better. Windows are wiped with a cloth that never becomes clean. Someone moves a bed to the far wall because even the idea of fewer drafts is a kindness. Children are told to keep their shoes by the door, and an extra ladle of broth is sent next door to the woman who stopped sweeping her steps halfway through. Distant cities write the volcano into books, a nearby village write it into habits, and on a night of odd stillness, the lighthouse throws its circle, and the circle lands, as it always has, on the shoulder of a man in a small boat, mid-channel, who looks up, nods to the beam like an old friend, and pulls once more on the oars in the direction he already knows he will go. Morning starts in control rooms long before the sun stirs the mountain slopes. Screens wake in blues and soft greens, pixels arranging themselves into weather, into the breathing of stone, into thin lines that quiver when the ground decides to speak. A technician sets a mug on a cork coaster and leans in, not for drama, but because patience lives close to the details. A ribbon of numbers crosses the top, tilt, tremor, gas, wind. Far above, a satellite slides over the curve of the Earth with the unhurried manners of space, looking down through a gauze of cloud to see if the mountain's shoulders have lifted by a few quiet millimeters. On another table, a row of radios waits with coiled cords like sleeping snakes, labels neat as schoolbook lines, and next to them a map is flanked by highlighters that already know where the riverbeds are restless and where yesterday's ash settled into a suggestion for tomorrow's water. Outside, the mountain is a good neighbor. It holds its shape against the blue. Snow, if it's that kind of mountain, fits itself into hollows, the way thought fits into a habit. Moss on lava keeps small promises. A goat tests a patch of grass and finds it reasonable. In villages that have learned how to face both harvest and hurry, alleys are kept a little wider than fashion, roofs a little sturdier than pride, doors a little easier to unlatch than worry would insist. Children walk to school and notice the painted arrows on the curbs, an everyday art that happens to point downhill toward the open road. No one needs the arrows this morning. They are there because practice begins on good days. In a lab that smells lightly of dust and coffee, bottles of captured air sit like patient guests. Each one holds gossip from a fumarole, whispers of sulfur, the tang of carbon dioxide, maybe a thin thread of hydrogen that wasn't worth mentioning last week and deserves a few lines today. Gas is language, and the people who listen to it keep grammar notebooks, ratios and seasonal moods, and also tape a small hand-lettered sign above the bench that says, "When in doubt, go look." So they do. Boots find their way along gravel, past old ropes that remember last year's corridor, across still warm rock where lizards keep their private council. A drone hums politely above a fumarole, dipping its tube to sip air, the way a careful cook tastes a sauce before committing to salt. No one calls this brave. It is only attention, extended where lungs cannot yet go. The ground speaks in Morse. Seismometers catch a rattle like cutlery in a drawer, then a sustained murmur like bees behind a wall, then a silence as deliberate as a held breath. Farther down the flank, GPS stations feel the land lift the thickness of a coin and send the news along fiber that glitters where it crosses a stream. Tilt meters report the kind of lean a person can't see, but a bubble can. All of it piles into a graph that looks at first like nervousness, but resolves under practiced eyes into cadence. This pattern loves to pretend it is another, older pattern. That one usually ends in a sigh, and this one has a way of ending in a sudden conversation with the sky. No alarms, not yet. A note to call the radio station at lunchtime and ask them, please, to rerun the preparedness piece after the midday weather. A reminder to order more masks for the health clinic because dust loves throats and throats deserve defenses. Down in town, preparedness looks like ordinary kindnesses sharpened into habits. A grocer keeps go bags on the bottom shelf where the rice used to sit, and a sign above them reads, "A bag you hope you never use, but will be happy to have." A teacher practices the sound of the new multilingual alert so she can imitate it with her voice in case the speaker system forgets its job. Bus routes are chosen for their speed to high ground, and the drivers have a second set of keys at home, another in the garage, and another with the baker across the street, because redundancy is an unshowy miracle. The municipal clerk, who has a tidy soul, keeps a paper copy of every phone tree in a drawer that opens smoothly, and a spare pair of reading glasses right on top. Long before any plume scribbles itself on a sky, there are maps, a whole family of them. One shows lava paths from older days, knuckles of black reaching into green. Another shows where ash likes to fall when the wind is indecisive. A third shows the places water takes grudges, laha channels that carry a mountain's impatience downslope with the strength of a small, determined ocean. Planners pin these maps together with thread, drawing lines where roads should be strong, where bridges want a higher arch, where a wall of concrete and rock, the kind with a soft name like Sabo, can cajole mud into pausing long enough to lose interest. They do not call it defense. They call it conversation, a set of invitations to flow here, not there, to pass under, not over, to wait a moment, then continue with less appetite. Airports are part of this choreography. The people who point planes toward the horizon check a different set of skies, the invisible lanes where ash can blind a turbine or sand a wing. Above their heads, another network watches for a thin grey veil laid careless across flight paths, satellites measuring the fingerprint of sulfur the way a detective lifts a print from a glass. Notices move. Avoid this level. Choose that lane. Step around the tall weather in the middle of the room. Airlines groan softly and refile. Pilots who learned a long time ago to trust instruments more than opinions still feel their chests loosen when the route bends away from a smear of brown that looks innocuous and isn't. In the tower, someone marks the change with a small circle on a sheet because a circle is quick and honest. Not every lesson is metal and graph. Some are older than the word lesson. A grandmother keeps a basket by the door because her grandmother did, and in that basket are 3 things that seem unrelated: a shawl, a small knife, and a little packet of salt. She could explain, or she could just say that when you must go, the shawl warms, the knife frees, the salt remembers food in a place that does not taste like home. Out in the fields, a farmer glances at clouds and knows 2 truths at once: that rain would be a kindness for the beans and a danger for the gully shaped by last year's flow. He banks the field edge with a line of stones anyway, an act so minor it will never see a report, and so major it will keep his neighbor's goat alive. A fisherman reads the angle of foam piled oddly in a bend of river, says nothing, moves his boat to the other mooring as if he had planned to do that all along. Practice happens in daylight. The siren doesn't wail. It clears its throat twice as agreed, and every block does what it promised on the laminated card pinned to the notice board. Doors open. Leashes are clipped. A woman grabs the folder with land titles and births and vaccinations and tucks it into the space in her backpack that was ruder names yesterday and is precious now. The slowest person sets the pace. The quickest person carries 2 of something. The man who usually jokes too much jokes just enough, and that is a contribution. They walk. A volunteer in a fluorescent vest counts softly. 1, 2, 3. At a crossroads, the numbers more for the counter than the counted. A metronome in a chest. Up on the ridge, the wind smells of thyme and the thin mineral note that means the mountain is awake enough to know its name. A child asks if the sheep are doing a drill too. Someone answers as if this were the most natural question in the world. In the observatory, the room bends toward accuracy. A scientist who has learned to be suspicious of drama leans back and lets the data make its own sentences. She remembers the time when warm months learned the habit of masks and quiet distance, and she knows that words can be another kind of protective gear. Simple, repeatable, breathable. She makes a draft and crosses out any verbs that pretend to be certain when they are not. She adds a phrase about wind shifting and how that will change ashfall here and not there. How masks are for neighbors as much as for noses. She sends it to the radio station because radio walks into kitchens. She sends a shorter version to a man who runs a popular group chat because group chats walk into pockets. On the slopes, engineers work with gravity as an old companion. They clear a culvert that prefers to nap. They swing a gate closed across a dirt road that likes to lure curious people into the wrong kind of proximity. They tie a ribbon on a boulder that has been rolling itself downhill grain by grain for months. And now that it wears a color, its slow pilgrimage becomes obvious enough for anyone to notice. They weld a bracket onto a guardrail and clamp a new sensor there. If the Lahar pushes past this line, the sensor will whisper to the siren, and the siren will know what to say. None of these are heroic acts. They are the ordinary seamwork that keeps the fabric from fraying exactly where fingers rub it every day. Schools have their own weather. A science class takes the little shake table out of the cupboard, and students stack wooden blocks into cities, then learn that triangles are friendly and tall skinny is not a personality to trust near a fault line. A geography teacher asks for pictures of places where lava met town and stayed to talk. The slides show walls built out of the cooled conversation. In art, ash becomes pigment, carefully, with masks and supervision, and a mural gets its sky crushed from what last month sat on windshield wipers. At the assembly, the principal holds up a flashlight and says, "Batteries are stories that last longer." A kid in the third row remembers that sentence on a future evening when the rooms are dark and the world insists on candles and the steady, persuasive glow of a hand-cranked radio. Money has a way of telling its own version of safety. A co-op meets under the jacaranda and agrees on a small fund with a wide purpose. Buy feed when the grass is wrong. Pay a mechanic to keep the bus honest. Replace windows only on the side that matters first. Help the widow on the corner replace the door that doesn't fit, since the last little quake made the frame argue with itself. An insurance agent who has grown allergic to adjectives shows a chart that does one useful trick. It lets people choose the kind of help that would let them sleep. No one uses the word resilience because it has become shiny with too many speeches. They say, instead, "We do this together or we don't do it at all." And they mean it. Forests near old flows where new decisions. Young trees go in terraces because roots make friends with steps. On a slope that likes to loosen under heavy rain, ground cover is planted that loves the work of holding. A fire break gets a path to follow, not a line to guess at. In the gully where last year's mud ran loud enough to drown out thought, a ladder of check dams invites future water to sit and consider itself before going on. Down in the flats, a field that grew maize now grows stone fruit because branches do more than feed, they intercept. The farmer calls it an experiment and keeps beans in the next plot because experiments deserve both curiosity and backup. Some mornings the mountain wants attention and gets it. Plumes audition with little gestures, and the radio tests its consonants. Airports practice patience. The observatory speaks in verbs that wear braces. People pack a little tighter and watch a little more kindly. The dog thinks all of this is a festival with fewer sausages than usual and does not complain. On other mornings, nothing happens at all, except the good things. Bread rises without persuasion, laundry dries with speed, milk foams thick in a pan with a sound like a whispering crowd. Even then, the habit stays close. The battery on the kitchen radio gets checked on the same day as the seeds in the drawer. The shoes are kept by the door toe out, not because it is tidy, but because toe out saves a breath. Networks cross borders without asking them for permission. When one volcano stirs, observatories 2 oceans away look up from their coffee and give their own screens a second glance, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a long acquaintance with family resemblance. A message arrives from a colleague in a country you have never visited, but could walk through in your mind from the way her sentences place the instruments like furniture. You send her your new script for a siren, the one that kills fewer birds and scares fewer children while still getting feet to move. She sends you a trick for making masks fit kinder on wide faces with a loop and knot. These are the trades that make a world. There are places where the mountain and the city have learned to live in each other's reflections. A street sweeper knows which corner gathers ash first and keeps an extra sweep for it every morning. An old man sits on a bench and watches both the summit and the bus schedule with the same calm fidelity. Tourists come, and they are greeted by signs that are both welcome and instruction. Water here, shelter there, path this way. No entry beyond this low fence without a guide who knows the gossip of the ground. A shop sells postcards of a night flow that once walked politely down a channel like a procession, and next to them hangs a laminated evacuation map with creases at all the important folds. The woman at the register, who has a grandson obsessed with rocks, hands out both with the same smile. Evening brings different instruments to life. The infrared camera paints a language where warmth is ink, and a quiet line appears on a slope that looked pale as ash in daylight. It is not a threat. It is a breath, a thin exhale from rock that remembers an old path. The night crew logs it and chooses a slightly stronger verb than note, then pours tea and leans closer to the screen that shows the Laha gauges along the river. Little blue bars rising and falling with the days melting and the hours' mood. A frog lands on the lens at Station 4 and turns the world into green for 7 seconds. The operator laughs and writes frog interference in the margin, because margins are where affection belongs. Not all memory lives in devices. A song in a language with plenty of words for water adds a verse about the new siren's rhythm and where to meet by the banyan. A story that used to end with a warning now pauses to teach the best way to wet a cloth for breathing and how to use your coat as a cradle for a frightened cat so your hands stay free. A carving on a school wall shows the mountain wearing a scarf of clouds and the town wearing a scarf of roads that lead out without knots. On market day, someone sells little ash-glazed cups shaped to sit steady on rough tables. They are beautiful, but more importantly, they feel like a promise that a cup will still be a cup when the table trembles. And always, information loops back into hands. A text arrives on a simple phone, the kind that clings to a charge like a miser to coins, saying only, "Ash afternoon likely, cover water, start early, share masks." No drama, no commentary. The message travels to a neighbor who didn't get it because he still uses the number he had before he decided to live up the hill. A bus driver reads a line about the far track being closed and nods because he drove that track yesterday and saw a fresh crack where a crack has no business being. A herder whose routes have more sense than maps sees a notice about the high pasture and chooses without resentment the second best grass for a week. By late night, the control room hums like a refrigerator. Present, useful, not loud enough to steal sleep from pates, anyone who is lucky enough to be sleeping. The mountain's heartbeats lay themselves across the screen, green on black, neat as knitting. In a drawer, there is a stack of printed leaflets, translated and checked with the little diagrams that teach without words. A mask tied properly, a foot stepping over a threshold with something like certainty. The shape a river takes when it stops being river and becomes persuasion. No one expects to hand them out tomorrow. They will be handsomely out of date in a few months and will be replaced with ones that are kinder to eyes and truer to wind. The practice of updating is its own safety. Outside, stars are impossible and true. Somewhere, a sensor blinks under a palm leaf, minding water that is minding rock that is minding fire. A dog sighs in its sleep and does not wake when a small tremor wrinkles the soil like a frowned forehead. Because this is home, and the house is set on its footings the way a dancer sets weight before a turn. In kitchens, pots soak for morning rice. On windowsills, ash collects like flour and will be wiped away easily if tomorrow begins ordinary. Up on the slope, steam stitches the mountain to the sky along a seam no one can measure except by learning its line. And from time to time, a gust tugs at the stitch and loosens it, reminding anyone who happens to be listening that the fabric holds for now, because enough hands are keeping it mended, because enough eyes keep watch without scaring themselves, because enough feet know which way the slope leans when it is time to walk with care. Thank you for drifting through these quiet histories with me. Embers, oceans, and all the ways people kept going when the sky turned strange. If this helped you unwind, tap like, subscribe, and leave a gentle note below about what you'd like to explore next. Your stories and questions guide where we wander. Until then, breathe easy, rest well, and I'll meet you in the next night's chapter. Good night.